The echoes of history often leave us with more questions than answers, teasing the edges of memory with tantalizing glimpses of forgotten empires and their untold legacies. One such empire, whose very name has been all but erased from our collective consciousness, once held the world in its grasp. This was a dynasty so powerful, so influential, that its rulers shaped the fate of entire civilizations. Yet, like the dust of time itself, its legacy faded, leaving behind only the faintest trace of its grandeur. Few today even know its name. This is the story of a dynasty that ruled a vast swath of the world, a dynasty that is now but a shadow, a mere whisper in the annals of forgotten kingdoms. In the heart of the ancient world, where the rivers of the Indus, the Nile, and the Tigris once flowed with the lifeblood of a thriving civilization, a kingdom emerged unlike any other. It was a kingdom born of conquest, ambition, and an unyielding vision of power. Its rulers did not merely seek to control lands, but to reshape the very fabric of history. They understood the weight of their decisions, the consequences of their ambitions, and the power of their name. Their kingdom spanned continents, stretched across oceans, and commanded the loyalty of kings and emperors. For centuries, they held sway over the course of empires, determined the fates of nations, and, in many ways, defined the world as it was known. Yet, despite the vastness of their dominion, their name has been lost to time. The world remembers other empires, Rome, Persia, China, but the story of this dynasty has all but disappeared. It is as if the very people who once wielded its power chose to erase it from the collective memory. What happened to them? What force, what event could cause such a mighty empire to fall so completely from the pages of history? Was it an internal collapse, the unraveling of a society so advanced it could not sustain itself? Or was it an external force, a rival kingdom, a conqueror so brutal, so relentless, that it obliterated everything the dynasty had built? To answer these questions, we must first understand the magnitude of the empire's reach. This was not a small kingdom, nor a fleeting power. At its peak, it stretched from the icy wastes of the northernmost territories to the sun-scorched deserts of the south. From the windswept steppes of the east to the fertile plains of the west, this empire controlled lands and peoples that others could only dream of subjugating. Its influence was felt in every corner of the known world. Trade routes were established, ideas exchanged, and cultures enriched under its dominion. The empire was a bridge between civilizations, a conduit for knowledge, art, and science. The rulers, with their divine right to govern, oversaw a society where order, justice, and prosperity reigned supreme. At least, that is what the records say. But there is a darker side to this empire, one that was hidden beneath the gleaming surface of its successes. Beneath the throne of power, the hearts of the rulers were not always as noble as history would like to believe. The dynasty was built on the backs of countless lives, many of which were lost in the pursuit of power and glory. Battles were fought not only against foreign enemies, but also against the very people who once swore fealty to the throne. Betrayal was as common as loyalty, and ambition was a weapon as sharp as any sword. In the corridors of power, trust was a rare commodity. The rulers may have been divinely chosen, but they were also human, and their flaws, greed, paranoia, and cruelty began to seep into the foundations of the empire. The story of this empire's rise and fall is one that is intertwined with the very fabric of human nature. It is a tale of ambition, hubris, and the relentless pursuit of power. It is a story of how the thirst for dominance can corrupt even the most enlightened of rulers, turning them into tyrants. And it is a tale of how even the mightiest empire can crumble when the forces of history conspire against it. At the height of its power, the dynasty was a marvel of organization and governance. Its leaders understood the importance of maintaining control over their vast empire, and they devised systems of administration that allowed them to manage their far-reaching domains with efficiency and precision. The bureaucracy was vast, yet effective, keeping the empire running like a well-oiled machine. Cities thrived, economies flourished, and culture blossomed under the empire's patronage. Architecture reached unprecedented heights, with grand structures that still stand as a testament to the vision of its rulers. The arts, too, flourished. Poetry, music, and philosophy were elevated to new levels of sophistication, drawing influence from every corner of the empire. In many ways, it was a golden age, a time when human potential seemed limitless. But as with all great empires, the seeds of its eventual downfall were sown in its very successes. The dynasty's rulers grew complacent in their power, believing that nothing could challenge their supremacy. They believed they were invincible, that their empire would last forever. Yet history is never kind to those who become too comfortable in their dominion. In time, the cracks began to appear. The empire's vastness became its weakness. Control over such a large territory became increasingly difficult to maintain, and the empire began to fracture. Rival factions emerged, each one vying for control, and infighting became a common theme in the halls of power. Externally, the empire faced growing threats. Nomadic tribes from the north began to raid its borders, while rising kingdoms to the east and west challenged its authority. Yet, it was the empire's own internal divisions that would prove to be its undoing. The once unified dynasty was now a house divided. Corruption ran rampant, and the once mighty bureaucracy became bogged down by inefficiency and greed. The rulers, once revered as divine, were now seen as weak and ineffectual. The people, once loyal to the crown, began to question the legitimacy of their rulers. The dynasty that had once commanded the world's respect was now crumbling from within. In its final days, the empire was nothing more than a shadow of its former self. The grandeur that once defined it had faded, replaced by a crumbling infrastructure and a fractured political landscape. The once proud capital, a city of unrivaled splendor, was now a shell of its former glory, its streets empty and its buildings falling into disrepair. The rulers, who had once held the world in their hands, were now reduced to powerless figures, struggling to maintain what little control they had left. And then, as quickly as it had risen, the empire fell. The world moved on, as it always does. New powers arose, new empires were built, and the legacy of the dynasty was lost. Yet, even in its fall, the empire left behind a legacy that continues to echo through history. Its achievements, its art, its philosophy, and its innovations influence the world in ways that are still felt today. Though its name may be forgotten, its impact on civilization cannot be denied. And perhaps, in the end, it is not the name of the empire that matters, but the lessons it leaves behind. For even the greatest of dynasties must eventually fall, and it is in their rise and fall that we find the true nature of power, ambition, and the fragility of human greatness. The story of this forgotten empire serves as a reminder that no power, no matter how great, is immune to the forces of time and history. In the vast tapestry of history, there are moments when the fate of entire civilizations is determined by forces beyond the control of mere mortals. These forces are not always as grand as wars or revolutions. Sometimes they manifest in quieter, more insidious ways. The rise of the forgotten dynasty was not the result of one singular event, but rather a confluence of circumstances, an unlikely series of decisions, alliances, and opportunities that propelled a humble kingdom to the height of its power. To understand the empire's ascent, one must first understand the individuals behind its foundation and the world in which they operated. The origins of the dynasty are shrouded in mystery, lost to time, like so many other ancient stories. Some say its founders were born from humble beginnings, peasants who rose through the ranks of fragmented, chaotic world. Others claim they were descendants of a once powerful warrior class, their bloodlines tracing back to the gods themselves. What is certain, however, is that their ambition was unmatched. Unlike other dynasties that were built on military conquest or religious domination, this one emerged from a place of cunning and strategy, exploiting the weaknesses of neighboring kingdoms and seizing opportunities that others had overlooked. The founders were not driven by a single desire for power. They were motivated by something deeper, something more primal. They sought to leave a legacy that would endure the ages, a mark on history that would be indelible, and they were willing to do whatever it took to achieve that goal. In the early days of the dynasty's rise, the world around them was in turmoil. The region that would become the heart of the empire was a patchwork of warring states, each vying for control over the fertile lands that lay between the great rivers. The economy was fragile, trade routes were perilous, and lawlessness reigned in many parts of the world. The dynastic rulers were acutely aware of the instability surrounding them, and they saw it as both a threat and an opportunity. The kingdom was small at first, barely more than a collection of villages and fortresses, but its leaders had a vision of uniting the fractured lands under one banner, of building a kingdom that could withstand the tides of time. The first of the dynasty's rulers was a figure of great charisma and foresight, a leader who inspired both loyalty and fear in equal measure. He was a man of paradoxes, combining the ruthlessness of a conqueror with the wisdom of a philosopher. His reign was marked by rapid expansion, but he was not merely a conqueror. He was a builder, a strategist who understood the importance of establishing strong foundations for the future. The first ruler's vision was not simply to create an empire that could dominate its neighbors. He sought to establish a legacy, to create something that would outlast even his own death. He envisioned an empire that would be governed not just by military might, but by law, culture, and trade. Under his leadership, the kingdom began to expand. One by one, neighboring kingdoms fell, either through military conquest or by diplomatic manipulation. The first ruler was a master of both war and peace, knowing when to strike with the sword and when to negotiate with the pen. But his ambitions were not without consequences. In his relentless pursuit of expansion, he sowed the seeds of dissent among his people. The very kingdom he had built began to show signs of strain. The demands of war, the need for constant military campaigns, and the insatiable thirst for more land began to take a toll. While the ruler's successes were undeniable, his internal governance faltered. The bureaucracy, which had once been efficient and well-organized, began to crumble under the weight of expansion. Corruption spread through the ranks, and the people, who had once supported the ruler with unwavering loyalty, began to question whether the price of their king's ambition was too high. These cracks in the foundation would later come to define the fate of the dynasty. Yet, despite these internal struggles, the empire continued to grow. Under the rule of the first monarch's descendants, the kingdom reached its zenith. The lands that had once been fragmented and chaotic were now united under one banner, and the empire was vast, stretching from the distant mountains in the north to the scorching deserts in the south, from the lush river valleys to the parched steppes. The capital city, once a humble settlement, was now a shining metropolis, filled with marble palaces, sprawling marketplaces, and towering monuments to the ruler's grandeur. The city pulsed with life, a vibrant hub of culture and commerce that attracted travelers and traders from distant lands. The empire's wealth was unmatched, its armies formidable, and its rulers revered as divine figures, chosen by the gods to rule over the earth. But with power came vulnerability. As the dynasty grew, so too did its enemies. What had once been a unified kingdom, united under a single ruler, now faced threats from all directions. The empire's borders were stretched thin, and the resources that had once fueled its expansion began to dwindle. The enemies it had once subdued now saw an opportunity to strike back. Factions that had been suppressed for generations began to rise, driven by their own ambitions and desires. The once unified empire was now a mosaic of competing interests, each vying for control. From within, dissent brewed. From without, danger loomed. It was during this period of expansion that the empire's most famous military campaign was launched, a campaign that would define the dynasty's reputation for generations to come. The empire's armies, led by the most skilled generals the world had ever seen, marched into territories that were once thought unconquerable. The campaign was swift and brutal, and its success solidified the dynasty's place as one of the most powerful in history. But in the aftermath of the campaign, as the dust settled and the last of the enemy forces were defeated, something remarkable happened. The victory, instead of solidifying the dynasty's power, began to reveal the empire's weaknesses. The campaign had been won, but it had come at a heavy cost. The empire's resources were exhausted, and its people were weary. The once loyal subjects of the dynasty began to question the wisdom of their rulers. The expansion, though successful, had overextended the empire's reach. The costs of maintaining such a vast empire, both in terms of military and economic resources, began to outweigh the benefits. The ruler, once seen as invincible, now appeared vulnerable. His own generals, once loyal to the throne, began to eye his position. The once unified empire was now fractured, its future uncertain. In the midst of this internal strife, the rulers of the dynasty found themselves at a crossroads. Would they continue to pursue expansion, even at the risk of destabilizing their own kingdom? Or would they consolidate their power and focus on maintaining what they had? It was a question that would haunt the dynasty for generations to come. The decision that was made would ultimately shape the course of history. It would lead to the rise of new powers, new alliances, and new conflicts. And it would set in motion the events that would eventually lead to the dynasty's downfall. The empire that had once been seen as an unstoppable force, an entity destined to last for eternity, was now at the mercy of forces both internal and external. The second chapter in the rise of this lost dynasty is marked not just by its achievements, but by its inevitable descent into conflict and division. The ambition that had once fueled the empire now became its greatest weakness. What had once been a united and powerful force was now a fractured entity, teetering on the edge of collapse. The question that would linger for centuries was simple. How does an empire, built on the strength of its rulers and their vision, fall from such heights? What force, internal or external, could bring an end to the mighty dynasty that had ruled the world? In the years that followed, the cracks in the empire would grow larger, and the seeds of its destruction would take root. But even in its decline, the dynasty would leave behind an indelible mark on history. Its legacy would endure, not in the power it once held, but in the lessons it taught. The rise and fall of this empire would become a cautionary tale, one that would be passed down through generations, warning future rulers of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fragility of power. As the once mighty empire began to fracture under the weight of its own ambitions, a new force began to emerge within its borders, one that would eventually prove to be as dangerous as any external threat. This force was not an army marching on the empire's gates, nor was it a foreign king bent on conquest. Instead, it was something more insidious, a creeping disillusionment among the people, a sense of betrayal that began to take root in every corner of the empire. The dynasty that had once been revered as divine now faced a growing crisis of legitimacy. The rulers, once seen as infallible, were now perceived as mere mortals, vulnerable, flawed, and increasingly out of touch with the very people they had once commanded. The signs of this shift were subtle at first. At the empire's peak, the rulers had been seen as the embodiment of power. They were divine figures, chosen by the gods to rule over all things. Their word was law, and their will was absolute. The people bowed before them, offering not only their loyalty, but their very lives. But over time, the emperor's vision, the grand ideals that had once united the empire, began to unravel. The expansion that had once seemed like a triumph now appeared reckless. The constant wars, the draining of resources, the expanding bureaucracy, each of these had begun to take their toll. What had once been a shining beacon of civilization had started to feel more like an oppressive, unwieldy empire. As the dynasty's internal struggles grew, so did its vulnerability. For the first time in centuries, the empire found itself divided, both politically and ideologically. The ruling class, which had once been a unified body of elites, now found itself fractured. Factions formed within the court, each vying for power, each with its own vision for the future of the empire. Some sought to consolidate the empire's holdings, to secure its borders and protect its legacy. Others, more ambitious, sought to extend the empire's reach even further, pushing into untapped territories at great cost. And then there were those who saw the writing on the wall, the growing discontent among the people, the crumbling infrastructure, and the endless wars, and believed that the empire's time had passed. For them, the question was no longer how to expand, but how to preserve what remained. The emperor, once a symbol of unity, found himself caught between these factions. His authority, which had once been absolute, was now increasingly questioned. He was no longer the central figure of power. Instead, he was a pawn in a game being played by the ambitious and the disillusioned. The court was filled with whispers of rebellion, of secret deals, and of plots to usurp the throne. The once great ruler, who had commanded the respect of kings and nations, now struggled to hold his own empire together. His advisors, once loyal to him, began to turn on each other, seeking their own advantage. What had once been a tightly controlled, well-organized kingdom was now slipping into chaos. At the same time, the people, once proud of their empire's might, began to lose faith in the rulers who had so carefully crafted it. The long years of war had drained them, both physically and emotionally. The promises of prosperity and glory had not been fulfilled. Instead, they saw only destruction and deprivation. The fields that had once yielded abundant harvests were now barren. The marketplaces that had once been filled with goods were now empty, and the streets that had once been alive with the bustle of commerce were now silent and desolate. The once great cities, whose marble halls had echoed with the voices of scholars, artists, and philosophers, were now in decline. The architecture that had once symbolized the empire's greatness was now in ruins. The people, once the proud subjects of the emperor, now saw themselves as little more than pawns in a game of power. They had given everything to the dynasty, but now they were left with nothing. It was during this time of disillusionment that a new figure began to rise, one who would challenge the very foundations of the empire. This figure was not a foreign invader, nor a rival king seeking conquest. Rather, it was a leader who emerged from within the empire itself, a figure who, like the emperor before him, possessed the ability to unite the fractured people, but whose goals were vastly different. He was not interested in preserving the dynasty or its legacy. Instead, he sought to tear down the old order, to create something new from the ashes of the empire. This leader, a charismatic and enigmatic figure, became a symbol of rebellion. His rise was not immediate. It was a gradual process, one that built on the discontent of the people. He began by speaking to the lower classes, those who had been abandoned by the empire's ruling elite. He promised them a new beginning, a chance to reclaim their lost dignity, and he rallied them to his cause. Slowly, his movement began to gather momentum, first in the provinces, then in the cities, until it reached the very heart of the empire. At first, the emperor and his court ignored the growing rebellion. They believed it was nothing more than a temporary disturbance, a fleeting challenge that would soon fade away. But as the leader's influence grew, so too did the threat he posed. He was a man of action, not words, and he quickly proved himself a capable military leader. His forces, initially small and disorganized, began to gain ground, and his message began to resonate with more and more people. The emperor, once seen as the ultimate authority, now found himself facing a rebellion that he could not ignore. The rebellion was not merely a military conflict. It was an ideological battle. The emperor's reign had been built on the idea of divine right, the belief that he was chosen by the gods to rule over all things. The rebel leader, on the other hand, rejected this notion. He believed that the people, not the gods, held the power to shape their own destiny. He rejected the monarchy the aristocracy, and the idea that a single ruler could wield absolute power over the lives of millions. His message was one of equality, of the people reclaiming their voice in the governance of the empire. It was a radical departure from the old order, and it struck at the very heart of the dynasty's legitimacy. The emperor, faced with a growing rebellion, had no choice but to take action. He rallied his own forces, calling upon the elite military units that had once been the pride of the empire. But even as he prepared for battle, it was clear that the empire was in decline. The once unified forces of the emperor were now divided, with many of his generals questioning his leadership. Some even sympathized with the rebel cause, seeing in it a chance to bring about the reforms that they believed the empire so desperately needed. The battle between the forces of the emperor and the rebel leader was fierce and brutal, a clash of ideologies as much as it was a clash of armies. The outcome of this conflict would determine the future of the empire. Would the emperor succeed in quelling the rebellion, preserving the old order, or would the rebel leader triumph, ushering in a new era of change? As the two forces prepared for battle, the fate of the empire hung in the balance. In the end, the battle proved to be more than just a struggle for power. It was a reflection of the empire's very soul. The dynasty, once so powerful and unified, was now divided, its foundations crumbling beneath the weight of its own contradictions. The rebellion, born from the frustration and disillusionment of the people, was not just a challenge to the emperor's rule. It was a challenge to the very idea of the empire itself. And in that challenge lay the seeds of the dynasty's ultimate downfall. As the dust of battle settled, one thing became clear. The empire that had once ruled the world was no more. The rebellion, though not without its own internal struggles, had succeeded in toppling the old order. The emperor, now a figurehead with little power, was forced to abdicate. His once great dynasty had been replaced by something new, something that would rise from the ashes of the old empire. The rebel leader, now the ruler of a new empire, had fulfilled his vision of overthrowing the old regime. But in doing so, he too would find that power, no matter how revolutionary, comes with its own costs. The fall of the dynasty was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one that would carry the lessons of the past into the future. The forgotten dynasty, whose name had once been synonymous with power, was now lost to the ages. But its legacy, for better or worse, would continue to shape the course of history. The fall of the dynasty was not a sudden collapse, nor was it a dramatic event that could be pinpointed to a single day or hour. Instead, it was a slow unraveling, a gradual erosion of power that spread through the empire like a creeping illness. The momentous battle between the emperor's forces and the rebel leader had been a turning point, but it was not the definitive end. The true decay had begun long before that, in the seeds of division sown by years of internal strife, corruption, and the slow but steady erosion of trust. In the aftermath of the battle, with the emperor dethroned and the rebel leader claiming victory, the empire did not experience an immediate transformation. The rebellion had toppled the old order, but the rebellion's leader, though charismatic and capable, was faced with a monumental task. Overthrowing the emperor was not enough to secure a new empire. The very foundations of the dynasty had been built on centuries of tradition, of divine right, and of unquestionable authority. To build something lasting from the ashes of the fallen empire was no simple task. The rebel leader, once hailed as a hero of the people, now faced the harsh reality of governance, and it was a burden that would prove far more difficult than he had anticipated. The transition from an established dynasty to a new regime was fraught with complications. The empire that the rebel leader sought to build was not just a political entity. It was an ideological one, and ideology alone was not enough to hold the fractured empire together. The new leader's vision was one of radical change, of a break from the past, yet the empire he sought to rule was one that had been built on centuries of tradition, deeply embedded customs, and an inherited system of governance that was not easily discarded. The old order may have been discredited, but the very structure of the empire, the bureaucracy, the military, the economy, was still rooted in the dynasty that had preceded him. In the early days of the new regime, the rebel leader made a concerted effort to dismantle the old systems. He sought to break down the power structures that had been maintained by the previous emperors, replacing them with more egalitarian institutions. The elite classes that had once ruled with absolute authority were now stripped of their privileges. The land that had been held by the aristocracy was redistributed to the people. Taxation systems that had once favored the wealthy were reformed, making sure that the burden fell more heavily on the old elite and less so on the common folk. The rebellion's promise of equality was now being implemented in full, and many believed that the new leader was fulfilling his vision of a more just society. However, the consequences of these actions began to emerge more quickly than the leader could have anticipated. The redistribution of wealth and power created a vacuum, and that vacuum was soon filled with chaos. The elite, now stripped of their titles and lands, did not simply disappear. Many of them had connections, wealth, and power of their own, and they were not about to let go of everything so easily. A network of resistance groups began to form, made up of disgruntled nobles, former generals, and influential figures who had once been a part of the imperial court. They began to plot against the new regime, seeing in the rebellion a threat to their way of life. But even more dangerous than these internal conspiracies was the rebellion's own lack of cohesion. The rebel leader, for all his charisma and ambition, found that not all of his followers shared the same vision. The idea of a new empire, of a world free from the old tyranny, was one that had united the people during the battle, but now, in the aftermath, the cracks began to show. Some of the rebel leader's supporters, who had once believed in the promise of a more equitable society, began to question his methods. The wealth redistribution, which had seemed like a necessary step at first, had begun to have unintended consequences. In some regions, local economies collapsed as land was seized from the aristocracy and redistributed to peasants who lacked the knowledge or resources to maintain it. In other areas, the influx of power into the hands of new rulers created a different form of tyranny, with former rebels becoming as corrupt as the rulers they had once overthrown. The problem of leadership was also becoming increasingly apparent. The rebel leader had emerged as a symbol of hope and change, but now, with the empire in shambles, his ability to govern was being put to the test. His military victories had proven his worth as a strategist, but governing an empire was an entirely different matter. His idealism, which had once been his greatest strength, now seemed insufficient in the face of the practical realities of ruling. The bureaucracy, which had been essential to maintaining the empire under the previous dynasty, was now an obstacle to the new regime. The administrative systems, corrupted by years of mismanagement under the old rulers, were slow to adapt to the new changes. The rebel leaders' attempts to implement reforms were met with resistance at every level, and his once loyal followers began to doubt whether the change they had fought for was even possible. In the province's local leaders, many of whom had been staunch supporters of the rebellion, began to consolidate power. The central authority, weakened by the rebellion's demands and the chaos of the empire's restructuring, struggled to maintain control. What had once been a unified empire was now the collection of semi-independent regions, each with its own agendas and priorities. Some regions, especially those that had been prosperous under the old regime, resisted the redistribution of wealth and power. These provinces had little interest in the new leader's promises of equality, seeing them as a direct threat to their wealth and status. The rebel leader's attempt to create a more egalitarian society, which had seemed so idealistic in theory, now appeared increasingly untenable in practice. The rebellion's triumph was also short-lived because of the lack of unity within the rebellion itself. What had started as a movement for the people had, in the eyes of many, become just another power struggle. The rebel leader, once seen as the embodiment of change, now seemed to be no better than the emperors he had overthrown. As the empire fractured, so did his hold on power. The promise of a better world, of a more just society, was starting to feel hollow. The people, once so hopeful, began to lose faith in the very man they had hailed as their liberator. Meanwhile, The former emperor, now exiled from his throne, watched from a distance as the empire he had once ruled continued to crumble. His defeat had been absolute, but he had not been vanquished entirely. The dethroned monarch may have lost his empire, but he had not lost his power. In exile, he began to form alliances with the remnants of the old aristocracy, with those who still believed in the divine right of kings. The former emperor's ambition had not been extinguished. He saw in the rebellion's failure an opportunity for his return. If the empire was truly falling apart, then perhaps the time had come for him to reclaim the throne. As the rebel leader struggled to maintain control over the fractured empire, whispers of a potential restoration began to spread. Former allies of the emperor began to rally to his cause. What had once been a distant memory of the old regime now became a rallying cry for those who longed for stability and order. In the eyes of many, the former emperor represented a return to the old ways, a restoration of the empire's greatness, of the order and power that had once defined the dynasty. The question now was no longer whether the dynasty would rise again, but when. The old imperial forces, despite their defeat, were not yet willing to let go of their claim to power. The empire, divided and fractured, was on the brink of another conflict, one that would either lead to the complete dissolution of the empire or to its resurrection in a new, more brutal form. The rebellion, which had once been seen as a triumph of the people, had only sown the seeds of further division. The dream of a just and equal empire seemed more distant than ever. The lost crown of power, once so within reach, now seemed almost out of sight. The fractured empire that had once been the envy of the known world was now teetering on the edge of complete disintegration. The rebellion that had toppled the old dynasty, while triumphant in its immediate aftermath, had failed to deliver the stability and justice it had promised. The new order, led by the charismatic but increasingly strained rebel leader, had begun to show its flaws. His vision of a more egalitarian society had faltered in the face of mounting resistance from former elites, internal power struggles, and the overwhelming challenges of governing a sprawling empire in disarray. What had begun as a revolution for the people had morphed into a bitter struggle for power, with each faction, whether noble or commoner, fighting to secure their own future in a crumbling empire. The most significant challenge, however, was not the rebellion itself, but the growing unrest that spread like wildfire throughout the empire's provinces. The central authority, weakened by the chaotic reforms and the disbanding of the old military structures, struggled to maintain control over the far-reaching territories. While the capital city, still the heart of the empire, remained under the rebel leader's control, many of the provinces were slipping through his grasp. Local leaders, once loyal to the imperial throne, now saw an opportunity to assert their own power. As the rebellion's promise of a new social order began to unravel, these regional leaders began to act independently, declaring themselves sovereign over their territories, and some even formed loose alliances with former imperial nobles who had been displaced by the reforms. The rebel leader, for all his intelligence and determination, found himself unable to contain the unraveling empire. His once loyal followers, many of whom had been inspired by the idealistic vision of a more just and equal society, were now disillusioned. The common people, who had rallied behind him in the early days, began to question whether they were better off under the new regime or under the old one. The promises of wealth redistribution, land reforms, and equality had not come to fruition as expected. While the land redistribution policies had been implemented, the resulting economic instability had left many of the lower classes more vulnerable than ever before. The promised prosperity had not materialized, and instead, a sense of uncertainty pervaded every corner of the empire. Farmers who had been given new land were struggling to cultivate it, lacking the resources and expertise to manage large estates. Markets that had once flourished were now desolate, and a growing sense of resentment simmered beneath the surface of the empire's once thriving cities. The rebel leader, facing widespread discontent, found himself forced into a difficult position. His supporters, many of them once idealistic revolutionaries, now demanded results. They had fought for a better world, but what they saw before them was a crumbling empire, weakened by its own contradictions. The new leaders' attempts at stabilizing the economy and maintaining order were often met with frustration and resistance from every quarter. Attempts to enact further reforms were either blocked or ignored by the very people who had once cheered his name. Even the military, which had once been a formidable force under his command, was beginning to splinter. The veteran generals who had led the rebellion were now questioning their loyalty to him, seeing his failure to unite the empire as a direct threat to their own power and influence. In the provinces, the once loyal military commanders began to distance themselves from the rebel leader. Some openly defied his authority, while others quietly conspired with local power brokers to carve out their own domains. These commanders had once fought side by side with the rebel leader, but now, with the empire in decline and no clear path to stability, they began to pursue their own ambitions. The military, which had been the backbone of the rebellion, was now fragmented, with rival factions battling for control over regions they had once defended as a unified force. The most pressing threat to the rebel leader's regime, however, came from the reemergence of the former emperor. In exile, the dethroned monarch had spent years nursing his wounds, waiting for the right moment to return to the throne. He had watched as the empire he once ruled collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. He saw the growing disillusionment among the people, the fragmentation of the military, and the failure of the rebel leader to deliver on his promises. To the former emperor, this was an opportunity, a chance to reclaim his lost crown. The former emperor, however, was not the same man who had once ruled the empire with an iron fist. Exile had changed him. He had spent years in the wilderness, cut off from the political intrigues of the capital, but in that time, he had learned the value of subtlety and strategy. No longer driven by the same sense of divine right that had once motivated him, he was now a more calculating and patient figure, well aware of the empire's weaknesses and the growing instability at its core. He had bided his time, building a network of loyalists within the empire's remaining power structures. Former imperial generals, disgraced nobles, and wealthy merchants who had lost everything under the rebellion were now quietly rallying to his cause, eager to restore the old order. They believed that the new regime had failed and that the only way to restore stability and prosperity was through the return of the imperial monarchy. The former emperor's supporters began to organize in secret, planning for a return to power. At first, their efforts were small, but as the rebel leader's grip on the empire weakened, their movement began to gain traction. Whispers of the former emperor's return spread like wildfire throughout the empire, and in the provinces, many of the local leaders who had grown disillusioned with the rebel leader's rule began to see the former emperor as a symbol of hope, someone who could restore order and bring the empire back to its former glory. The former emperor, now a figure of myth and legend, was seen by many as the only solution to the empire's growing problems. As the rebel leader struggled to maintain control over his fractured empire, the former emperor made his move. With the support of key military commanders and political figures, he staged a coup, capturing several important cities with minimal resistance. His return to power was swift and decisive. The rebel leader, now facing a two-front war, one against the former emperor and another against the growing number of rebellious generals and provincial leaders, found himself fighting a battle he could not win. His once strong army, divided and demoralized, was no match for the former emperor's forces, which were well organized and unified by a shared vision of restoring the old regime. In the face of the coup, the rebel leader's position became increasingly untenable. His former allies began to desert him, and his own supporters, once so passionate about his vision for a new society, began to question whether his leadership was worth the cost. The provinces, once firmly under his control, now began to fall back into the hands of the former imperial rulers. The people, tired of the constant strife and empty promises, began to rally behind the former emperor, believing that his return would restore peace and stability. The rebel leader, now isolated and on the run, had no choice but to abandon the capital city, which fell shortly thereafter to the forces loyal to the former emperor. The capital, once the symbol of the rebellion's triumph, now became a symbol of its failure. The emperor, whose throne had been usurped, had regained his power. But in doing so, he inherited an empire fractured beyond recognition, an empire that had been weakened by years of infighting, corruption, and disillusionment. As the former emperor reclaimed his throne, it became apparent that the empire was no longer what it had once been. The unity that had defined the old dynasty was gone, replaced by a series of competing factions and rivalries. The empire, once a beacon of power, was now a shadow of its former self. The former emperor had restored his own personal reign, but he could not undo the damage that had been done. The people, once hopeful of a brighter future, now found themselves once again under the yoke of an emperor who, though restored to the throne, was no longer the ruler of the same vast empire. The dream of a unified and prosperous empire had slipped further out of reach. The question now was not whether the former emperor could maintain his reign, but whether he could do anything to restore the greatness that had once been. For the lost crown of power, once worn so proudly, was now tarnished, and its legacy was one of fractured ambition, broken promises, and a world forever changed. The re-emergence of the former emperor, triumphant in his return to the throne, was not the resounding victory he had hoped for. While he had succeeded in ousting the rebellious forces that had once threatened his reign, the empire he inherited was no longer the powerhouse it had been. It was fractured, broken by years of internal conflict and external instability. His return was less a restoration of the old order and more a reluctant acknowledgement of the decay that had taken root in every corner of the empire. For all the promises of restoration, the former emperor now faced an empire on the brink of collapse, its once unified territories now divided by competing factions, rival leaders, and a people who had grown increasingly indifferent to the idea of monarchy. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the former emperor was forced to confront the reality that the empire he had once ruled no longer existed in the form it had. The rebellion's successes, which had brought an end to his reign, had not only shattered the imperial power structure, but had also eroded the cultural and ideological fabric that had once held the empire together. The people, once loyal to the dynasty, had grown weary of the constant strife and promises that never materialized. The radical changes brought by the rebels had left an indelible mark, and now, even under the former emperor's rule, the scars were impossible to ignore. The former emperor's immediate challenge was not simply to restore the old imperial glory. It was to make sense of a broken empire and to piece together the remnants of a society that had been forever altered. His authority, though once absolute, was now questioned by many who had lived through the rebellion and its aftermath. The old system, which had relied on a centralized authority and an unshakable belief in the divine right of rulers, no longer seemed adequate in a world that had tasted the bitter fruit of rebellion. The former emperor could not simply step back into the role he had once held, assuming that the people would fall in line as they had before. He was now a ruler in a world that had fundamentally changed, and the challenges he faced were far more complex than anything he had encountered in his earlier reign. The empire, once so vast, was now divided into a patchwork of competing factions. The provincial governors, who had once been loyal subjects of the crown, had grown accustomed to their newfound autonomy. Many of them had fought in the rebellion, supporting the cause of equality and reform, but now, under the former emperor's rule, they were reluctant to return to the old ways of centralized control. They had their own ambitions and their own power bases, and they were not inclined to cede control back to the emperor without significant concessions. The imperial bureaucracy, which had once been a well-oiled machine, was now a tangled web of competing interests. Corruption, which had been rampant during the old regime, had only worsened under the new leadership. The vast infrastructure of the empire, once held together by the centralized authority of the imperial court, was now a shadow of its former self. The emperor's attempts to reassert control over the bureaucracy were met with resistance from every level. The imperial court, once the center of political life, was now a cacophony of rival factions, each vying for influence and power. The former emperor, no longer the unchallenged authority he once was, struggled to navigate this web of intrigue and ambition. The military, which had once been the backbone of the empire, was now divided and fractured. The former emperor's return had not restored the unity it once had. Many of the generals who had supported his overthrow were now either dead, exiled, or disillusioned with the idea of a return to the imperial order. The rebel leader, though defeated, had left a lasting impact on the military. The sense of camaraderie that had once existed among the imperial forces was now replaced by distrust and division. Some of the former generals had shifted their loyalties to the new order, while others had turned their backs on the emperor altogether. The military was no longer a cohesive force. It was a fractured institution, unable to unite behind any one leader. The rebellion's leaders, though defeated, had not disappeared entirely. Many of them had gone underground, their supporters still loyal to the ideals they had espoused. The former emperor's efforts to rebuild the imperial military and bureaucracy were constantly undermined by the remnants of the rebellion, who continued to challenge his authority at every turn. The idea of a centralized, authoritarian rule was no longer popular among the people, many of whom had embraced the promise of a more egalitarian society, however flawed it had turned out to be. The rebel leader's vision, though imperfect, had struck a chord with the people, and now, in the wake of the former emperor's return, they were unwilling to simply forget it. The former emperor, now ruling over a fractured and divided empire, found himself forced to navigate a delicate balance. He could not return to the old ways, for the people and the provinces would never accept it. Yet, he could not fully embrace the ideals of the rebellion, for that would mean abandoning the very institution that had defined his rule. The empire was no longer a place where one man could dictate the course of events. It had become a battlefield for competing ideologies, where the old order and the new struggled for dominance. The emperor's most pressing challenge was to secure his legitimacy in the eyes of the people. He had once been seen as the embodiment of divine power, chosen by the gods to rule. But now, he was a man struggling to hold together an empire that had long since lost its faith in him. The rebellion had exposed the cracks in the imperial system, and the emperor now had to reckon with the fact that his divine right was no longer a source of unquestioned authority. The people, having lived through the chaos of the rebellion, no longer viewed the monarchy as sacrosanct. The divine right of kings was a concept that had been shattered, and the emperor had to find a new way to connect with the people. One of the emperor's strategies to regain legitimacy was to frame his return not as a restoration of the old order, but as the beginning of a new chapter in the empire's history. He attempted to paint his rule as a necessary step in healing the wounds of the past and rebuilding a fractured empire. He promised reforms, though not the radical changes that had been promised by the rebels. His reforms were pragmatic, aimed at stabilizing the economy, restoring order, and rebuilding the military. He sought to balance the competing factions within the empire, offering concessions to the provincial leaders while attempting to reassert imperial authority. Yet, despite his efforts, the divisions within the empire remained as entrenched as ever. The provinces, once fiercely loyal to the imperial crown, were now centers of resistance to centralized rule. The idea of a unified empire under a single, powerful monarch was an increasingly distant dream. In the capital city, where the emperor's presence had once been a symbol of unchallenged power, the atmosphere was now one of uncertainty. The people, once united in their reverence for the emperor, were now divided in their loyalties. Some, still loyal to the old dynasty, clung to the hope that the emperor's return would restore the greatness of the past. Others, disillusioned by the years of war and rebellion, had come to see the emperor as just another figurehead, one who would not be able to bring back the prosperity and stability they so desperately sought. The once great imperial court was now a place of intrigue and suspicion, where the emperor's every decision was scrutinized and his every move was second-guessed. The people who had once celebrated his rule now looked to him with doubt and wariness. Outside the capital, the provinces were in varying states of rebellion or semi-autonomy. Some regions, particularly those that had once been the most prosperous, remained loyal to the former emperor, but they were a minority. Others had fallen under the influence of regional warlords or rebellious leaders who rejected the idea of centralized rule. These provinces, once part of a unified empire, were now independent fiefdoms, each with its own ambitions and rivalries. The emperor's efforts to reintegrate these territories into the empire were met with hostility, as many of the provincial leaders saw him as an illegitimate ruler, a monarch who had returned only to assert control over lands that had long been autonomous. The empire, once a vast and powerful entity, was now a broken shell of its former self. The emperor, despite his best efforts, could not repair the damage that had been done. His return had not brought the stability he had hoped for. Instead, it had opened old wounds, reigniting the struggles for power that had defined the empire's history. The dream of a unified, prosperous empire was now a distant memory. The crown, once a symbol of absolute power, had become a burden too heavy for any single ruler to bear. The former emperor, now in the twilight of his reign, was left to wonder whether his return had truly been a triumph or whether it had merely prolonged the inevitable. He had regained his throne, but in doing so, he had inherited an empire that was already beyond saving. The lost crown of power, once so firmly his, had now become a symbol not of glory, but of defeat. As the former emperor struggled to navigate the delicate balance of power, he quickly realized that the challenges of governing an empire in decline were far more complex than he had ever anticipated. The years of rebellion, internal strife, and external pressures had left deep scars on the empire, scars that could not be easily healed by the return of a monarch who had once been revered as the embodiment of divine right. The former emperor, now a ruler in a world that had irreversibly changed, had to confront not only the remnants of the rebellion, but also the growing discontent among his people. It became clear that the road ahead would not be one of easy restoration. The empire, once the envy of the known world, had now become a fractured entity, with competing factions, rival leaders, and a populace divided between loyalty to the old ways and disillusionment with the promises of reform. One of the former emperor's first realizations was that the old system of governance, which had once been a source of strength, was no longer tenable. The empire's vast bureaucracy, built over centuries, had been corrupted by greed, inefficiency, and mismanagement. The imperial court, once a hub of political intrigue, had now become a battlefield for competing factions. The once unified imperial family, whose members had ruled with unquestioned authority, was now fractured, with various branches of the family vying for power and influence. The former emperor found himself surrounded by rivals, not just from the old aristocracy, but also from the newly empowered provincial governors and military leaders. These leaders, who had once been loyal to the crown, had now established their own power bases and were increasingly reluctant to accept the authority of a ruler who had been absent for so long. The former emperor's attempts to reassert central authority were met with resistance at every turn. The provinces, once part of a unified empire, had now become semi-autonomous regions, each with its own local rulers and agendas. The idea of a centralized government, with a single ruler at its helm, was no longer popular. Many of the provincial leaders, once loyal to the emperor, now saw themselves as the true power in the empire. They controlled vast territories, commanded loyal armies, and held sway over the local populations. To these regional rulers, the former emperor's return was a reminder of a time they had hoped to leave behind, a time of centralized control, aristocratic privilege, and divine right. For them, the rebellion had offered the hope of breaking free from the emperor's authority, and now that hope seemed to be slipping away. In an attempt to consolidate his power, the former emperor sought to broker alliances with the provincial leaders. He offered them autonomy in exchange for their loyalty, hoping to strike a delicate balance between central control and local independence. But these leaders, many of whom had long been accustomed to ruling without interference from the capital, were not easily swayed. They were suspicious of the emperor's motives and reluctant to place their trust in a ruler who had been absent during the most tumultuous period in the empire's history. The former emperor, realizing that his power was dependent on their cooperation, began to make concessions. He promised reforms, granting the provinces greater control over their own affairs. Yet, these promises were not enough to placate the growing sense of rebellion among the provincial rulers, many of whom had already begun to consider their own future outside of imperial rule. In the capital, the situation was no better. The imperial court, once a symbol of unity and power, had become a den of intrigue and deception. The nobility, once loyal to the emperor, were now divided, each faction vying for influence and control. Some nobles sought to align themselves with the provincial governors, hoping to secure their own place in the new order. Others, more traditionalist in their outlook, still clung to the idea of a strong, centralized monarchy. The former emperor, caught between these competing factions, struggled to maintain his authority over the court. His every decision was scrutinized, his every move analyzed. The once proud imperial court, with its grandeur and elegance, had become a place of suspicion and betrayal, where loyalty was a rare commodity and power was the ultimate currency. Meanwhile, the people, who had once rallied behind the idea of a united empire, were now disillusioned. The promises of a new era, one of prosperity, equality, and justice, had failed to materialize. The rebellion, which had seemed so promising, had turned out to be nothing more than a power struggle between competing factions, each with its own agenda. The common people, once hopeful of a brighter future, had now grown weary of the endless infighting and broken promises. They had seen their cities ravaged by war, their lands left barren by the upheavals of rebellion, and their lives marked by uncertainty and fear. In the wake of the former emperor's return, many of the common folk wondered whether things would ever truly improve. Would the empire ever find its way back to the glory it had once known, or was it doomed to be a fractured, divided land, forever trapped in a cycle of power struggles and unrest? The former emperor, aware of the growing discontent among the people, sought to restore his legitimacy in their eyes. He knew that his reign could only be secure if he had the support of the masses. But winning their loyalty was no simple task. The emperor's return had been heralded as a triumph, but it had failed to deliver the stability and prosperity that the people had hoped for. His reforms, though well-intentioned, had not been enough to reverse the damage caused by years of internal conflict. The people, tired of empty promises, began to turn their attention to other leaders, including the remnants of the rebellion's leadership. While many of the rebels had been defeated, their ideals had not been entirely extinguished. The promise of a more equitable society still resonated with a portion of the population, and the former emperor's inability to fulfill the vision of the rebellion left a vacuum that others were eager to fill. The former emperor, now facing increasing opposition from both the elites and the common people, realized that the situation was growing increasingly untenable. His once unquestioned authority was slipping away, and he was no longer the unifying figure he had once been. The empire, now a fractured collection of competing factions, was no longer a place where one ruler could impose his will. The former emperor's return, once seen as a victory, was now viewed as a reminder of the empire's failures. His promises of reform had been met with skepticism, and his efforts to restore the imperial order had only deepened the divisions within the empire. As the days passed, the former emperor grew more and more isolated. His attempts to appease the provincial rulers, the nobility, and the people had failed, and his reign was increasingly seen as a futile attempt to cling to power. The empire, once a symbol of greatness, had become a shattered shell, its glory long faded. The emperor, once the most powerful man in the world, was now a ruler without a true empire to govern. The dream of restoring the old order, of reuniting the empire under one ruler, seemed further and further out of reach. It was then that the emperor realized that he had not only lost the trust of his people, but also the very thing that had once made him powerful: the belief in his divine right to rule. The rebellion had shattered that belief, and no matter how many promises he made or concessions he offered, the people would never see him as the unassailable ruler he once was. The empire was no longer a place where one man's rule could dictate the course of history. The former emperor's reign had become a symbol of the past, a past that was no longer relevant in a world that had moved beyond the old ways. In his final days on the throne, the former emperor became a tragic figure, a man who had once held the world in his hands, but who now faced the bitter truth that the empire he had once ruled was lost to history. His efforts to restore the monarchy, to rebuild the imperial order, had failed. The crown, once a symbol of absolute power, had become a hollow relic, a reminder of a bygone era. The people, once devoted to his cause, had moved on, seeking hope in new leaders, new ideologies, and new possibilities. The lost crown of power, once so firmly held, had slipped from his grasp. This seventh chapter further explores the complexities of the former emperor's attempts to restore his reign in a fractured empire. The narrative delves into his struggles to reclaim authority, the internal power struggles within the court and provinces, the disillusionment of the people, and the ultimate realization that his reign is a mere reflection of a lost past. The once dominant ruler finds himself trapped in a world where his legitimacy is no longer unquestioned, and his dreams of empire begin to fade into history.